at Western New York Legal Services for people who are interested in doing employment work. So I also have a opening at the National Day Laborer Organizing Network. So they're looking for Spanish law students. So if you're interested, please email me if you're interested in any of these positions, and I can give you more information.
Thanks. Any other announcements? Danielle or someone from the public interest?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's Danielle Sorkin, the director of the Public Service Law Center. I guess just to mention for the students, our PILC workshop was last week. If you missed it, everything is up on Canvas. So all of our handouts, a recording of the program. The 1Ls, we will be registering you for PILC on December 1st and 2nd. Upperclassmen, we encourage you to still register. Definitely look for summer internships there, but you need to register yourself. All you need is your student ID. That's all you'll need to register, your name and your student ID number. So we encourage you to register. And then we're going to have another program. Can't remember the first week of December, which is up on about how to go through the website, which is pretty much going to be the same as last year for those of you who went last year. So that's all I got.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to give a big thanks to Professor Debbie Bechtel and the other faculty and Spare Fellows who are helping with the interviewing. We know it's like a really, really busy time of year, but that's really helpful. So thank you, we appreciate it. And then also a huge thanks to Sarah Francois who organized this panel and will now take it away.
Hi, Sarah Francois, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to introduce the panelists with like their bios that I got either from the internet or from another person. And if I say your name wrong, please correct me. I'm not known as Sarah Francis for a reason, because I tell people it's Francois. Kate D'Amato is a longtime sex worker rights advocate with a focus on economic justice and anti-policing and incarceration and public health. Previously, she was a national policy advocate at the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Center, focusing on law, policies, and advocacy focused on folks who trade sex, including criminalization of sex work, anti-trafficking policies, and HIV-specific laws. Prior to the Sex Workers Project, Kate was a community organizer and an advocate with the Sex Workers Outreach Project and Sex Workers Action New York. She holds degrees from California Polytechnic State University and the New School. R.J. Thompson is a longtime human rights lawyer, organizer, educator, a certified personal trainer, a go-go dancer, and performer in the adult film industry. Prior to joining the Sex Workers Project as the managing director, RJ worked at the Fair Courts Project community educator at Lambda Legal, where he trained judges, attorneys, and court staff on gender and sexuality, cultural competency, and advocated for judicial diversity and judicial independence in Arizona, Texas, Florida, and the federal bench. All of our panelists have like really amazing and long bios, and you can read more about them on the internet. John Hurst has been a practicing attorney in New York. He's a senior trial lawyer with Legal Aid Society's criminal defense practice and has worked as a public defender in Manhattan, the Bronx, and in Providence, Rhode Island. He graduated from Columbia Law School in 2002 and is the former vice president of the National Lawyers Guild New York City chapter. And prior to law school, even, he was a labor organizer in Montana, in Washington, D.C., and Baltimore. MD, I don't remember what that is. Maryland. Eliza Orleans is a candidate for Manhattan District Attorney, which she's a public defender, outspoken advocate for New York City's most vulnerable. For more than a decade, she has fought courtroom battles representing over 3,000 New Yorkers who otherwise would not be able to afford a lawyer. In March, Eliza announced her candidacy for Manhattan District Attorney and is running on a platform designed to decriminalize poverty and mass incarceration and take on the inequities of our system and transform criminal justice in New York to make our cities safer for everyone. My disclaimer is that Brooklyn Law School does not endorse any candidates running for office. I was told that I have to say that, and it's been said. Hi, Professor. I've basically had all of the professors on here. I tried to narrow all of my questions down to 4 questions that I felt like I could not ask because I was told that I need to leave room for the audience and ask questions and not monopolize the time. And there's 46 participants. So I just want to give the panelists a chance to answer this question. The first question is, why is this issue even important? You can answer it based on individually to you or individually or like as a whole to society. Anyone can jump in or I can point you out. RJ.
For me, this issue is important. It's very personal to me as a longtime sex worker in both criminalized and legal sectors of the trades, but as a human rights advocate, first and foremost, regardless of issue or identity, I see things through a human rights framework, and I believe that the human rights of sex workers are absolutely not protected, promoted, or even acknowledged in this country and in most of the world, with criminalization being one of the largest issues impacting our human rights, but also wage theft, sexual harassment, racial discrimination, stalking, police misconduct, and on and on. So for me, this movement to decriminalize sex work is part of a broader movement to decriminalize many things that should never have been criminalized in the first place, but for white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And we see movement in that regard with Oregon's drug decriminalization this past election, which was historic, marijuana decrim, and other things where Black folks, Indigenous folks, trans folks, and poor folks bear the brunt of the impacts of criminalization. And so for us at the Sex Workers Project, and for me personally, this is a racial justice issue and a gender justice issue, as well as a labor issue and a sexual liberation issue. Sex and sexuality are so deeply stigmatized in our country. Even while we see and talk about sex a lot, we have this very schizophrenic relationship with sex and sexuality that is based on a lot of Judeo-Christian puritanical values. And so sex work is demonized, stigmatized, and criminalized because of sex and sexuality, and also because of the ways in which bodies have always historically been policed in this culture.
Miss Eliza Orleans.
RJ nailed it. Oh my gosh, RJ, you're amazing. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. That was incredible and so true. And all of this being so intertwined. And I've spent my career as a public defender, and I'm dedicated to defending workers' rights, reforming our criminal legal system, and ending exploitation. And we know that the criminalization of sex work puts everyone in sex work at risk rather than protecting them. So like other forms of prohibition, this has been a long-running disaster, which makes it harder for women and trans folks and other marginalized people to come out of the shadows and into legal protection in situations of abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. And so I think this issue is often ignored by politicians. And I don't think of myself as a politician. I'm a public defender who happens to be running for office. But I think that a lot of times people shy away from it because they think it's controversial or unglamorous or easy to make into a political attack. But I think that what's so important is by speaking out about this and saying that decriminalizing sex work will help protect and support some of the most marginalized members of our communities and will make New York City safer and more just for everyone. And so I think we all on this call probably agree. We know what the policies are. We just need people with the courage to stand up and do what's right. And we can help those who are vulnerable and who are excluded and marginalized from the system. And get New Yorkers out of danger so they no longer have to live in fear and so they can do their jobs. And so that's kind of where I'm coming at this from. But it's an honor to be here with all of you. And thanks for having me.
John Hirsch.
One thing that, while I agree with everything that's been said, and I don't think I could say it better, one of the things that needs to be added to this conversation too is that when you criminalize something, you put people not only do you take away their ability to seek legal protections, which they should have and need to have. This includes marginalized groups that end up, some of which end up being in jeopardy through sex work, but you also subject them to police brutality. One of the things that we researched this summer was just how much police brutality is involved in sex work, and how much one of the things that's come to light over the last 8 months through the Black Lives Matter uprising has been this understanding that that when you put people in contact with the police, you put them in danger of oppression from the police. And the statistics that we found were shocking and alarming at the incredibly high numbers of victims of sexual violence at the hands of the police who are unable to seek justice themselves due to the criminalization of it. So it's really a twofold problem. One, you're taking away their rights. Two, you're putting them in direct danger of the people who are supposed to enforce them by criminalizing it.
Kate Tiamato.
Yeah, and I definitely co-sign everything that everyone has said thus far. And I come to decriminalization and this conversation. Yes, I recognize how much of it is legal, but I come from a community organizing and a community member background, and so I think that when we talk about sex worker liberation, and when we talk about the people who are engaging in commercial sex, we're generally talking about people who are living at the nexus of economic justice and criminalization. You're talking about the criminalization of poverty, but really specifically, yes, people across the gender spectrum engage in sex work, but you're especially overwhelmingly talking about women and femmes of color. You're talking about people who are more likely to be parents and caregivers. You're talking about people who experience disability in myriad forms. You're talking about people with prior systemic involvement. And so I think that, yes, I come from the experience and I come from the community. And so obviously, sex work is totally important to me. And at the same time, I think when we're talking about social justice work, we're often talking about, if you center people who are LGBTQ, who are experiencing intersections of harm, when you're experiencing not just singular forms of marginalization, but really the hierarchy beyond as the oppressor, then you're talking about lifting up people who are living at some of these intersections, and you're generally talking about people who are engaging in informal work and criminalized work. And when you center those experiences, everyone, all boats are lifted. If you're centering a population that is more likely to be migrants, that is more likely to be experiencing these things, if you just center the story of sex workers, then you're really centering people where focusing on that form of liberation and that community's liberation and uplifting and survival, everyone is uplifted. And you're probably going to be dealing with a lot of the kind of individualized issues that we kind of try to cherry pick off sometimes when we do incremental work, engaging in social justice. And so that, I think, beyond my own personal desires, is really why centering the story of sex workers is essential to holistic forms of liberation and social justice.
So my second question is, what are some of the misgivings people have about decriminalization of prostitution, and what are your responses to these misgivings? RJ.
One of the things we deal with on a daily, if not hourly basis at SWP, and I'm sure my colleagues who fight for this issue as well, is the conflation of human trafficking and sex work and work, specifically sex work, and the large and very strong voice of anti-trafficking advocates who support what we call a Nordic or Swedish or end demand or even equality model. This is different names for the same paradigm, or the complete abolition of sex work, right? So the Nordic or end demand model is to focus criminalization on customers, clients, rather than workers. And all of these things are promoted in this country and many countries because of a misunderstanding or intentional conflation, actually among some, between sex work and human trafficking. We at SWP are anti-trafficking advocates as well as sex worker rights advocates. Those are not two mutually exclusive things. Many of our clients have been survivors of trafficking at different points in their life and also done freely consensual sex work at different points in their life. The way that US laws are written, a person, for example, who's 19 and helping to safety plan and work with a colleague who's maybe 17 can be and often is charged with trafficking. And so the laws themselves are very problematic in the US. Sex trafficking gets an inordinate amount of attention versus other forms of human trafficking. And we always at SWP talk about human trafficking as a whole because much, if not most, of human trafficking occurs in other labor sectors, including farm labor, domestic labor, and other sectors. And yet it's very, unfortunately, funders, elected officials, many advocates find it trendy or sexy to focus on sex trafficking rather than all the egregious human rights violations in the other labor sectors. They go so far even to say that we should eradicate the sex trades to end human trafficking, but they never suggest such about labor, about farm labor, domestic labor, restaurant labor, or other sectors. And so that shows you that their agenda is really an anti-sex work agenda that comes out of second wave feminism and often, by the way, those folks are often anti-trans as well. It's often the same people who over decades have held anti-trans policies, the serfs and the TERFs. And so this conflation really harms and slows down our progress around everything we do towards advancing the human rights of sex workers in this country. If I had to choose one problem, besides the lack of resources to this movement, it would be this conflation. And so we're constantly educating around this issue and that sex work exists like almost everything else on a spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion, and that those are not three individual buckets, but things that overlap and intersect. And so that constant destigmatization, deconflation, and education has to go hand in hand with any of our efforts to change law and policy.
Can we just continue in the same order?
Sure. Again, following RJ is like such a pleasure because he lays it out so clearly and beautifully. And I think that it's so true that the issues that I see when I talk about the decriminalization of sex work are people who say, well, nobody is engaging in consensual sex work. People fail to understand why people trade sex, and they even if it's out of economic need, to pay bills, to make rent, to put food on the table, or after, again, as I think RJ mentioned, somebody who has dealt with a major life event, like a healthcare bill that leaves them economically vulnerable. And oftentimes it is our, LGBTQ, Black and Brown, immigrant and disabled communities who are in sex work in higher rates because they are locked out of jobs in the formal economy. And so I think like coming at it from this standpoint of thinking about the prosecution of this, like so many people think, oh, well, people get arrested and prosecuted because they're breaking the law, because they're doing something wrong. But, if you think about the fact that in New York, one of the things that is still criminalized, it's still on the books, is a law called loitering for the purpose of prostitution. And 94% of the people who get arrested for this are Black women. And this statute is used to target trans people. You'll often hear it called the Walking While Trans bill. And it's like a ban on walking while trans. Like you can't even exist, even if you are not trading sex, but that you are just existing in this world and people are getting arrested and disproportionately targeted just for existing. And so I think that it's so important to think about the way in which, not only we change the laws to police these things, but that we end the prosecution of essentially all prostitution related offenses, including, of course, loitering for the purpose of prostitution, or offenses where these offenses have been used as a pretext for the arrest. So if you think about the fact that in unlicensed massage cases, these are often, people who are getting wrapped up because of this. You know, there are these motions that we file as public defenders to try to, for trafficking survivors, to try to vacate criminal records. And there's opposition. You know, the district attorney has the ability to consent preemptively to all motions for trafficking survivors to vacate criminal records, and yet they don't do that. They fight against it, and it makes it very difficult. And so I think that there's so much more that we need to think about in terms of, you know, these fights that still exist. People, I think someone mentioned the paternalistic nature of this, and we say, oh, well, we're going to assume that everyone is a human trafficking survivor, and we need to intervene, and we need to mandate sessions and mandate court and mandate supervision, and it's all this compulsory and onerous services that are required. And I think that we need to end that to make sure that people are having the right to exist, that they can do their jobs, that they can live freely as themselves. So that's what I would say as my addition.
To add to the conversation, and I think there's so much has been said that it's almost hard at this point to add to this great conversation. I agree with everything that's been said. The one thing that turned up in our research was that we got here through
Among the strongest rights that come with owning property is the right to exclude anyone or even everyone from the property. But there are always exceptions to every rule, and in the 1908 case of...
Sorry, I just muted everyone. So can people just mute yourselves, and then the panelists can unmute. Thanks.
Great. So we got to this point in time through a really insidious, misogynistic, and actually it was also incredibly interlinked with a very racist policy of the broken windows theory of Rudy Giuliani. The idea being that by labeling certain groups of people undesirable and basically playing on all of the worst parts of our bigotries, we would be able to create wholesale criminalization of groups of people under some sort of erroneous economic theory about really, it was a very Trumpian kind of idea that led us to this moment, right? And I think that was always the question was what is some of the things you hear and then have to refute? And one of the things that we still battle when we talk to especially people who are more in the undecided category of voters or even Republicans is this really erroneous and factually proven wrong idea of the broken windows theory that prostitution and sex work got labeled into. And I think that prostitution being the legal crime and sex work being the actual act, that we got labeled into with this really, really terrible history that comes from the 90s. And I think that's just something to kind of add to this conversation. That's something that really, I think we still battle and we still need to be aware of that in some people's minds that's still a valid legal philosophy, and it's really not.
Again, I agree with everything that's been said. I think, and this comes out of, I've been doing a lot of, I'm down in Baltimore now. And so decriminalization is a lot of community meetings and going and sitting in wards with people. And I get the same questions kind of over and over again. And I think the thing that, and this is on both sides, the people who are pro-decrim, the people who are concerned about it, and the people who are against it. I think the biggest misconception is that it's the end of the conversation and not the beginning. You know, when so many questions are coming up with people who, you know, and this is very specific to DC and Baltimore, where it's the question of like, you know, what's going to happen? Is it going to be harder to reach out to people? Is it going to look different if it's decriminalized? What do I do if I see something and I'm not sure about it? How do I make sure that I don't want to live on a stroll? And those are all kind of valid things. Decriminalization, you know, it gets talked about in a lot of different ways, but decriminalization exists and only for citizens in New Zealand and in one province in Australia. And those are very specific contexts. And there's a lot of things that we don't know, and we're going to have to, you know, figure out along the way what happens with people. Does decriminalization deal with child welfare? Does it deal with access to resources? What happens with people who are incarcerated? Does decriminalization mean that everyone's going to get a possession charge instead, or a loitering charge instead of loitering for the purposes of prostitution? what's going to happen to different neighborhoods when these things happen? And so we still have a lot of question marks. And I think that the biggest misconception is that when we pass decriminalization, and, you know, we're hearing this now out of Oregon with, oh, they decriminalized low-level possession of all these different drugs, the war is over. And that's not the case. All we're saying with decriminalization is that right now, we know that criminalization and policing makes things worse. And it means that we can't have meaningful conversations. We know that there is a period at the end of the conversation. There's a hammer where there should be 1,000 different tools to deal with the many issues that come up for folks that are engaged in commercial sex. There's still a lack of resources. There's still a lack of options if you have been assaulted and don't want to engage the police. And so all decriminalization does is say, let's fucking have these conversations and let's make it easier for people who are experiencing this to come to the table and talk about their needs and their experiences. Decriminalization doesn't end anything, and it doesn't really give us as many answers as we wish it did. All we're saying is that it allows a real conversation with people who are living the consequences, and where those consequences are vulnerability, exploitation, violence, and death. That's all we're saying, is that what we're doing now makes lives worse. And this is the way that we can really actually seriously talk about making lives better.
Since I'm conscious of the time, I'm going to ask one more question. And I'm going to ask a really out of the box kind of a question, because I, like, one of the former professors from BLS, he engaged in a thought exercise, I would say, and wrote a paper about, like, in an ideal world, like, how would you imagine, like, his topic was like how sex crimes in general are dealt with. But I'm asking, like, in particular, if I could, like, wave a magic wand over the criminalization of prostitution, how would you fix it?
Like, what does our ideal world look like post decrim, basically, for this issue? So for me, you know, I would like to live in a world and work towards a world every day where people do not have, at the very core, shame, stigma, secrecy, trauma around their own sexualities, in a world where people, you know, as cliche as it may sound, are really free to be exactly who they are in terms of their gender expression, their sexual expression, and that as long as they are not harming anyone else, and we live in a consent culture that you know, adults can make their choices in life and do what they need to do, what they want to do. And so for me, you know, this issue is so many things, but it is, as a sexual liberationist, as someone who believes in sexual freedom, as someone who thinks our sexual rights movements, as a human rights lawyer who believes sexuality has been taken out of sexual rights movements, LGBT, reproductive justice, sex worker rights, we desexualize these movements for respectability politics, for political strategy and compromise, and because of shame and stigma. I always want to recenter sex and sexuality in the conversation, as well as race and gender and economics. These are universal human aspects of humanity, and to ignore them, to erase them, to shame them is inherently dehumanizing. And so while the issue of working in the sex trades is very complicated and obviously multi-factored, I think many in our society would like to throw sexualities that don't fit into their paradigm of what is normal into the shadows and keep them in the shadows. You know, and that goes for so many issues, sex work and beyond. I also want to see a world where we have economic justice, obviously, and that is obviously easier said than done. And so for me, nothing short of political, economic, and actual human revolution will achieve that. We may not see that in our lifetimes, but every social justice and human rights issue worth working towards goes above and beyond us or even our lifetimes, right? So I want to see a world where all human beings, including all workers, are respected and protected, and actually where we have a level of economic justice and racial justice and gender justice where people have a myriad of choices, where jobs are not put on a hierarchy, where we can see everybody's role in society as valuable, whether that be a heart surgeon or an erotic masseur or a person working in food service. And that people have, basic autonomy, the basic human right to autonomy and freedom of choice. So that's a very pie in the sky answer, but I think that is what your question is going to.
I mean, I think that's a beautiful answer, though, and I think that that's what we're all here for. That we would love to see a world in which everyone could be protected. That we have, racial justice, economic justice, sexuality justice, gender justice. That all workers are protected. That no one is, criminalized as a human being or incarcerated or punished for engaging in their job, that no one is vulnerable to violence, that no one is unsafe, that no one is stigmatized, because I think that is part of it. RJ mentioned the stigma, but it's true that that the stigma exists to such a large degree that it takes away the ability for people to seek safety and seek justice when needed. And it harms people who are coerced into the sex trade, and we're not saying that shouldn't be addressed, because of course it should, but I think that we need to, be investing in communities and think about having sex worker led and survivor centered services that are provided, and support efforts to disband vice squads in their entirety, because they really put human beings in danger. Ideally, not only do we elect district attorneys who want to stop the prosecution of all prostitution and related offenses, but that actually legislation passes that fully decriminalizes and repeals these laws that have really hurt human beings for such a long period of time. And I think we need to be vacating records for trafficking survivors. We need to, just think about centering the people who've been the most hurt by this and who are vulnerable, and hopefully get to a place where, our marginalized neighbors are safe and protected and are taken care of and are economically, able to live their lives and feel like they can live their lives as who they are. And I think that the talking about I participated in the Black trans sex worker liberation march, and it's true. Like, if there is liberation for Black trans sex workers, there's liberation for everyone. So it's like, when we fight for those who are the most marginalized, that's how we are going to achieve, a real equitable society for everyone.
There's going to come a moment, hopefully, when our struggles bear fruit and we decriminalize sex work. And at that moment, it's going to be very perilous, because capitalism is an incredibly insidious thing. And we could find ourselves moving quickly from exploited, criminalized sex workers to just exploited, legalized sex work, which is something you've seen in Nevada, for example, where now you have a huge problem of it's a workers' rights problem. And as somebody who spent a lot of time in the labor movement and as a union organizer and labor organizer, it's going to be very important that we're forward thinking. I actually think this question's incredibly critical, because we are on the cusp, I think, of changing the hearts and minds of the general population in terms of decriminalizing sex work. But if that gets replaced with a ruling oligarchy of capitalists, like what happened in Nevada, we'll have missed an opportunity to really engage in meaningful liberation. So I think that one of the things that we need to demand is not just that sex work be decriminalized, but that sex workers have a place at the table for what that future looks like, whether that's what regulations or no regulations. How does that look to meet their needs, and to make sure in the end that this very lucrative work that they engage in stays within their means in terms of financial control. And I think that that's going to be an employment law issue. I think that's going to be a union issue. I think that's going to be a whole host of legal issues that go beyond the current criminal law issue, and needs to be something that, and I know that people are thinking about this going forward, because if not, it's this, I don't know the exact amount, but we're talking about one of the, a major, if you add up all of the kinds of sex work right now, it's billions of dollars. And it's not going to take long for people to try to weasel that away from the people who earn the means of the production. So that's the one thing I think we need to talk about, whether it's wholesale unionizing of sex workers or a kind of owner-operated system that gives sex workers an incredible amount of freedom and control over their incomes, and which is appropriate, by the way, considering it's they should maintain control over they should maintain autonomy, because we're talking about their own work.
I'm really into everything that John just said, especially, I'm really into everything that everyone just said. But yes, absolutely. Like, it's amazing when you talk to not just like the Department of Labor, when you talk to unions, the second you sit down and actually talk about like, what is informal labor to you? How do you understand informal labor? How do you understand exploitation in informal labor? And we're just getting blank stares. And when we're talking about, it was 40% of the economy was informal labor and gig workers prior to the pandemic. And they were saying it was going to be over 50% by 2028. We're looking at like next year for it to be over 50%. And so we can't lose the fact that like, and this is why I think it's also, if we're going to talk about ideal worlds, my ideal world is not a world under capitalism and doesn't have jobs. And so I think there's an incremental conversation about workers' rights and about labor rights and what that means under an economy, not even a changing economy, an economy that has changed and that we are decades behind understanding in a realistic way. And talking about economic justice and access to resources. I think if we're, my ideal world is that it really is a reproductive justice issue and a sexual liberation issue in the way that, if we're going to stop talking about work, then we can start talking about how everyone should be able to find community and communion and touch and affection in a way that honors who they are, and that should not have to happen under capitalism. And when it does, it should be dignified and it should be honored as the beautiful and important experience that it is. Divorced from a price point, divorced from an experience. It is not undignified work at its core at any level of experience. And so I think that is my ideal. And in the meantime, I think we need to take serious stock about if we are going to, we have to fight capitalism, yes. And while we're working under capitalism, we have to make sure that we honor the way that, work sucks. And informal work often sucks, and low-wage labor sucks, and it sucks for the same people over and over and over again. And taking that conversation really, really seriously about how we liberate people, and if this is going to be a serious workers' rights movement, we have to engage in solidarity with all of the different communities that engage in forms of labor that have no protections, that have no support, that have no solidarity, that have no, that are not offered dignity and respect, and that are regularly exploited.
At this point in time, I want to open it up for the audience to have questions. I am not able to see raise hand function. So Professor Gatso, if you could help with that, or if you could post your questions in the chat. And if you have no questions, I happen to have a million.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'll keep the queue. And first we have the other original Kate, or Kate Mogilewski.
Hi, everyone. So this has been a chorus of agreement and love and sort of anti-capitalist musings, which is all, right on. But until capitalism is dismantled, which might not happen by the end of the year, might not happen by the next legislative session in New York, I'd like to bring us back to sort of some of the real obstacles in terms of decrim in New York State or in this moment. And one of the things that I think we hear all the time, like so many people today have referenced community and what community in sort of this monolithic way that, okay, criminalization is harmful. But one of the things that's weaponized most in the fight to continue policing and to continue prosecution and oppression is community and community conditions, community complaints, and communities that actually want law enforcement intervention and don't, Kate says, you know, you don't want to live on a stroll. You don't want to live, the example that politicians always give around this is you don't want to be walking your child to school in the morning around condom wrappers, God forbid, you know, thing, right? And this is all an extension of anti-sex everything that we've talked about, but is real and is what we hear. So I'm interested, and I think RJ and Kate might be able to answer this more specifically just based on the work that they've done with how do you respond about community and how do you shift perceptions in community about what an appropriate response is? So where there is concern about activity that's happening, what have you all done in your organizing work to have those conversations within the very communities that are then used to as a way to oppose reform? And Kate, I'm very glad that you wore the guillotine earrings for today. I like when those come out.
Here is to those earrings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing that always stands out to me as a memory in my organizing at SWP is when we went to speak to community boards a couple of years ago. We did a circuit of training at community boards across New York City. And very similar to what you just said, Kate, concerns around the condom wrappers always come up. There was a particular bodega owner who had repeatedly complained to the community board about opening up shop and having condom wrappers or used condoms even littering their front. And for me, you know, my strategy when I'm able to engage people face-to-face dialogue on these issues is to try to really help them to think differently and to problematize, you know, what it really is that they have an issue with. So for example, in this situation, I asked, you know, is it litter that really bothers you? Or is it that it's condoms, right? Would it bother you? Would you be calling 311 or the community board if it was banana peels all over your front entryway? And it may sound trite, but I think it goes to a real substantive issue about, again, stigma. That stigma is so deeply held, people don't think of it as stigma. They just think of, you know, what is normal or appropriate to them. Who is a community member? So I like to problematize for folks, you know, Giuliani's quality of life crimes was brought up earlier in this panel. And anyone who's lived in New York knows what that did. So, you know, another issue in that same community board meeting was the mom, in this particular case, the white mom pushing her baby stroller to the river in East Harlem and having to, God forbid, walk past sex workers who are engaging in business in the park. And so I was able to use the example of quality of life policing and laws that many people in the community board themselves understood as problematic for Black and brown and poor communities, to say, when these laws are developed or enforced, there is an inherent hierarchy of who matters, of who belongs, of who should even be in public space, who has a right to even be in a park or a sidewalk. And of course, you know, the white mom pushing her stroller is the answer to that. That's who matters, not street-based sex workers who are simply doing their jobs in the safest way they know how to do, or in the safest place given the circumstances and the options they have. And so in that particular training / meeting, at least I saw light bulbs go off and people start to sort of question why, who matters and who doesn't. And it sounds so basic to some of us, but that's where we're at. We're at a level of internalized thinking about, you know, when we say Black Lives Matter, it's obviously, and the reason we push back to All Lives Matter is because we're not there. We have white supremacy to tackle, you know? And so the same goes with the implicit thing that they're saying is, we don't want, if that's gonna exist, sex work, we don't wanna see it. We surely don't wanna see it. We don't wanna see remnants of it, clues to it. And so, you know, I don't have all the answers to this, Lord knows, but I do know that we need to be engaging in dialogue with community members, community leaders, and elected officials around the reality that they or their constituents actually believe that some people matter more than others, and that we cannot create policy in the United States based on some people mattering more than others. We might have to come up with creative solutions, but you know, I was able in that training to get folks to acknowledge that, at least to our faces, acknowledge that the sex workers' work was not less important than the bodega owners' work, and that the sex workers' lives and right to simply be in space, in public space, shouldn't be less important than a gentrifying mom, for example. Now, how we move that from rhetoric or a one-on-one dialogue to actual policy change is part of the challenge, right? But I think that we shouldn't underestimate the power of those dialogues, because we have to call out what this is really about, even when it's uncomfortable.
I'm also a huge proponent of going and sitting in community with people and having those conversations, going to the different wards in DC and having really honest conversations that also start from a place of not assuming that that person wants to cause harm. And, there's a lot of really valid fears and discomforts that are brought forward. And, sometimes it is the person who wants to gentrify a neighborhood who's like, I don't want to see the remnants of what I came into here. I don't feel comfortable with that. And I think also reminding people that there's a lot of people that don't want to do street-based work in a place where they're getting the police called on them by assholes. There's a lot of people who criminalization and policing put us in these adversarial relationships that we don't want to be in either. And so, there was one conversation recently that someone I organized with went and did and started talking about all right, well, what do you think the solution should be? What would you propose? And the ideas they came out with were things like worker centers. If we're talking about litter, we can't actually just put in trash cans. If we are talking about the fact that I don't want a crowd of people that might draw attention and be loud on my street at 3 o'clock in the morning, that's valid. If you're talking to someone who is, especially an older person of color who's I have Black grandsons and I don't want an excuse for my neighbors to call the police because I'm afraid of how they're going to interact. That is a valid fear. And I'm in Baltimore. And so abolish the police is the ethos here. And so oftentimes it's about reminding people that we're all in community together and that policing harms all of us. It puts all of us in this situation that we don't want to be in. And we can actually strategize. Figuring out different ways for communities to interact with each other is not a new conversation. And we figured out how to do it before. We've done worker centers because day laborers were in an unsafe space and we wanted a place where folks could go to. People move online for a reason. There's different ways that we can tackle this. And so I think going in and just having really honest conversations that honor their concerns and fears as people living in a neighborhood that they consider that they don't necessarily know how to engage with, especially, when we're talking to people who are I see something that looks really scary and really violent to me, and I'm too afraid to put myself in. And so I need someone to call too. All of those things are super valid. And so, I think just the basics of building community and saying sex workers are part of your community too. So let's all have a dialogue and have a conversation about what everyone's needs are and who's forced to do things that they don't want to do but don't really have any other options. That's true on both sides of this conversation. And so if we can actually talk to each other and recognize that criminalization forces us to be adversaries when we are actually just community members together working through our circumstances, and those are hard, constrained circumstances, and this is about removing one of the constraints, it's a much easier conversation, especially just locally. And especially when you're in a circumstance where you come from a place of honoring the fears of every single person that you're sitting with. Because that's not true. I have almost never gone to a community meeting where someone came in with a really deep-seated desire for abolition of sex workers as humans.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
I want to highlight a question that's in the chat. If the aim is decriminalization, what steps should be / need to be taken in regards to health risk? I know John mentioned unionizing is part of the decrim movement to mandate healthcare for sex workers.
And I, for one, put my answer to that in the chat.
Does John or Eliza want to start?
I would actually bounce this to Eliza if she wants to talk about it, because I think as a Manhattan DA, she would have resources to address some of these issues, and she might want to speak to that. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that this actually ties back into the last question as well. I think that it's so problematic because what we see is, I mean, I'm running against a number of people who, when asked, do you support the Nordic model, they say, well, we refer to it as the equality model. And I mean, we all know that's the exact same thing. And so pushing back on that is something that is part of what we're dealing with here. And the paternalistic way in which the courts really just subject people to these human trafficking intervention court and mandate these compulsory and onerous services for victims and survivors of the sex trade are like, it's just completely, it's illogical. It doesn't help anyone. And it is something that, yes, as district attorney, you can allocate funds, you can redistribute the asset forfeiture funds that, the DA's office has control of almost $1 billion. It's around $800 million of budget that can be allocated into services. And I do think that thinking about this in a survivor-centered way and helping people as opposed to, criminalizing them and forcing them into things. I think what RJ says in the chat is quite interesting, because I do think that that some of it is stigmatization, like you say, oh, well, we're going to mandate something. And once you're mandating something, you are like kind of stepping into that paternalistic role of additionally stigmatizing. And especially when it comes from someone in a position of power, like a district attorney or something else, it's putting additional restrictions on people. So I think that it's a great, but also complicated question.
I also want to throw the question to Kate, because I know that you're coming from a public health background.
Yeah, one of the things that I always ask people, almost every single panel that I do, sex workers definitely face negative health poorer outcomes than most other people. I want us to change our language because I'm very Chomskyan, and I think the way that we talk influences the way that we think. Sex workers are not an at-risk population. Sex workers are a population who are put at risk because of the way that sex workers are criminalized and policed. So one of the things that they've seen is when you increase criminalization in areas where condom use was the default, because you can't negotiate it with a cop who's policing you because that is evidence of prostitution, condom use went from a default conversation to a maybe conversation, and condom use declined significantly. When you look at places where people can negotiate, there's an assumption that sex workers are careless, but actually, sex workers use their bodies as their medium of work, and so are incredibly protective of their health. Sex workers generally know more about health and sexual health than most people who are our clients. And so I think that criminalization has negative health outcomes because your health all of a sudden becomes in play with policing. And I think access to healthcare, I also recognize that like OSHA standards exist in different forms of intimate labor. And so if we're going to talk about creating occupational health standards for sex work as a form of intimate labor, especially in brothels, especially levels of sanitization, that kind of stuff, like that's a conversation. And, having that in a space of occupational health and safety is very different than having that in a space of criminalization. And so I think once we start treating sex work like any other profession where there's different levels of what you have to do, nannying and providing very intimate care for children is very different than when you hire a high schooler to babysit. And so having the range of that profession, but no one's going to jail for being 16 and babysitting and not necessarily following the same occupational health and safety standards as a daycare. And so, making sure that we're treating this as a profession, one that has physical and intimate labor as a part of it, is a really important thing. And healthcare definitely falls under one of those other pieces of, you know, if we pull off criminalization, if we normalize it, if we treat it like the profession that it is, that has a diversity of engagement from a diversity of people, then all of a sudden those questions and those conversations are things that we're doing already, and we're doing in 1,000 other different jobs, and become really, really easy. It's just that we silo them and make a lot of assumptions about sex work that are really based on like Law and Order, and not like the show, and not necessarily like the actual experiences of people in the sex trade. We know how to have these dialogues. We just have to have them.
And I'm sorry, Sarah, but I have a hard stop enough to jump off in a second. Can I make one point I wasn't able to make? I don't want to disrupt the flow, but I think it's really important to say, I try to say this explicitly in every space I get the opportunity to talk about sex work. Sex workers save lives. We save people's lives. I used to say sex workers do valuable work, that people provide valuable services people need, and that is absolutely true as well. But I've taken it a step further, that we actually save lives. And you never hear that, and I know that to be true from my own clients as a sex worker, from one of our donors at SWP, who is devoting his everything he has to this issue, because he attributes sex workers to why he is alive today. We help people overcome everything from depression and anxiety to sexual performance issues. We do disability justice work. We give end of life care. When do you ever hear that? I know someone who fed a client their last bowl of ice cream as their last wish and held them while they died. Who talks about that? Sex workers save lives, and that is what I wanted to leave you all with for my part.
Thank you, RJ. I want to piggyback off of that, because during our research, John kept mentioning our research. It's literally me and him. We wrote a paper this summer, and so it was our research. That's what he meant by our. Our research, we found actually a country that actually pays for sex workers to be trained in disability, like providing disability services as part of their intimate care, and actually that it was covered by Medicaid, their like version of Medicaid. So that was really remarkable. I just want to say thank you to everyone and respect everybody's time, because we only have a minute left. I saw your question, Professor Grazzo. Sorry. Kate is answering it in the chat.
Well, thank you guys all so much. I think we all learned so much. And thank you, Sarah, for putting this all together and moderating it. So thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.